A lot happening in the world today. As you know, if you've been watching the news, some big things happening in our country, especially at our southern border, our northern border as well, but more so at the southern border. We certainly see a lot of people flooding into the country illegally, 5,000 a day, they say, come across that border. We don't have a country without enforcing a border. All countries on the earth have immigration policies and rules. We seem to have thrown that to the side. God did say lawlessness would abound at the time of the end, and we're seeing that in our country. What are the repercussions? We're already seeing things like up in New York where government officials are saying, open your home and take people in. We see schools being filled with illegals where kids stay home and go to school because the school's full of people who have come into the country illegally. We certainly understand legal immigration. We're all for that. But illegal immigration is a problem. And we see this battle going on now down in Texas. This could lead to great division in America. And as we know in Luke 11:17, a house divided against itself cannot stand. We're committing suicide as a nation from within. We are a military giant, but that doesn't matter if God pulls his blessings away. And he does that, by the way, because of sin. A lot of even conservative people out there that see this open border as a problem don't want to talk about the problem as sin. What we're doing is wrong. As a nation, we've rejected God. We've rejected his laws. How do we get to a point where abominable sins have become not only acceptable, but promoted and encouraged by government officials and by people in general? How do we get to a point where the big news this past week is man becomes pregnant? What that heading really should have read, that article should have said, is woman who undergoes sex change still proven to be a woman, is what it should have said. Because that's really what happened. But this is breaking news. It's earth-shattering. It's just, carried on every network and reporting agency. What a joke. And how did we get to the point where we can't tell if you're a man or a woman, right? Like, and how do we have men, looking like women, running in women's sports and competing? I never assumed that this would ever happen. I know my dad and granddad certainly didn't. We look at what's happening in the world today and we're just awed. How quickly did we deteriorate and how far have we gone? Where does this end? We see, even, for instance, FBI and CIA and things like this, where they're filling quotas now. They've got to get the handicapped. They've got to get all the races represented. We've got to get women represented. And so we're putting people in high positions that are unqualified. They can't pass the exams to even become a part of these agencies, but we're filling these agencies with these quotas. We see this in universities. We drop the standards for different demographics because we want to equally let everybody come in. It's not based on merit anymore. It's not based on you studied hard, you got good grades, you're at the top of the list. You get in and the other guy doesn't, or the other girl doesn't. This is all going to lead to the downfall of America and result in strife and chaos like we've never seen. And we know right now this is a house divided, and we see in politics a very interesting year ahead of us. Donald Trump is crushing it in the polls. If he gets in there, what's going to happen? If he doesn't get in there, what's going to happen? Like, we can't predict. Every time I try to figure something out now, I'm like, no, I'm glad I didn't say anything about that, because it didn't happen that way. It happened a different way. The way God is orchestrating this and the way this is coming together is absolutely amazing. And today I want to talk about a woman, but this is another kind of woman. The title of the sermon is, Who is the Woman Who Rides the Beast? Obviously a very important topic as we come into the end of the age. In the 6th chapter of the book of Revelation, we read about the 4 horsemen, and we see that the first of the four horsemen is represented in verses 1 and 2. Go to Revelation 6, verses 1 and 2. It says, "Now I saw the Lamb open one of the seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures saying with a voice like thunder, 'Come and see.' And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer." This verse represents a Christ, but in this case, a false Christ. It is true that this Christ or this horseman represents a gospel and a church, but it's a false gospel and a false church, all in the name of Jesus Christ, but in truth, a deception, a clever counterfeit. We know that this horseman is identified very clearly in Scripture, and if you carefully compare Revelation 6, verses 1 and 2, and Revelation 19, verses 11 to 15, you will see that the first horseman is no more than a clever counterfeit Christ, one that is close enough on the outside, on the surface, to fool the majority, but not the elect. The returning Christ in Revelation chapter 19 brandishes a sword out of his mouth. A sword is his word. It's the Bible. Hebrews 4:12 tells us the word of God in symbol is called a two-edged sword. So the true Christ represented in Revelation 19, verses 11 to 15. A counterfeit represented here comes with a bow in his hand. And he comes conquering and to conquer. And we also know from the time setting, Revelation 6 and Revelation 19 are very far apart in the time setting. In fact, they couldn't be further apart in end time events. The white horse of the first seal, when that's opened, is the first event in the unfolding drama at the time of the end. Christ's second coming, on the other hand, ushers in the end of the drama. So the first five seals, we have the four horsemen and we have the martyrdom of the saints, which we'll look at here in a minute, is a time of tribulation. It is Satan's wrath on human beings. And then the sixth seal, we have signs in the heavens, these astronomical signs. God gets everybody's attention, and then God gets involved, and he pours out the trumpet plagues in succession. 7 trumpets are blown, and they're followed up with the 7 last plagues. But Christ returns when? At the last trump, at the 7th trumpet. So we can prove just in the time setting that this horse in Revelation 6, verse 1 and 2 is different, represents something different. The long-term condition of false religion was described by Paul and others in many verses, right, in the New Testament. But the white horse here, when this seal is open, is talking about an event yet future, in the immediate future, frankly, and it will kind of lead off end-time events. The long-term condition of false religion that's described here and in many other scriptures will culminate in the end-time fulfillment of the white horse of Revelation 6 in the person of the great false prophet. This false prophet will come on the scene in the years shortly ahead of us, or months, and from the midst of many conflicting nominal Christian groups and sects that argue and debate, a single individual will emerge of immense personal power, of magnetism. He will have charisma. He will eclipse all the others, and he will rise to prominence. And that will happen just prior to the cataclysms at the end of the age, and he will signal the beginning of sorrows, as the Bible calls it. This deception is described in 2 Thessalonians 2. Let's go there. 2 Thessalonians 2. And this is an important topic here at the end of the age, and we should be watching and praying and taking note of what's happening on the world stage. I noticed even recently, last week I think it was, I saw a video of the World Economic Summit, the forum, and they had a woman, looked like an Asian descent woman, who was invoking the spirits and was going down the line and blowing into the face, puffing into the face of each of the people that were conducting the seminars, open demonism at the World Economic Summit. What is going on in Europe? Man, this is getting serious, and we need to be watching to see what's happening. Second Thessalonians 2, verse 8, it says, "And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming." And we read about that in the later chapters of the book of Revelation, that Christ, when he returns, he's going to deal with the beast, the human leader of the beast power, and the false prophet. He's going to take care of that problem once and for all. It says, verse 9, "The coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders." This is somebody who is either possessed or certainly influenced by Satan himself and the demons. And he's going to come with power, signs, and lying wonders. And he will be incredibly deceptive. The world is going to go, wow, this has to be the prophet, right? This has to be God. Look at what he's able to do. And he's going to sell it. And people will be wowed and shocked and sucked into this. He says, "And with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth, that they might be saved." So again, this is a powerful instrument of Satan, the devil himself, who dazzles the world with miracles. He will also mobilize vast armies of formerly lukewarm professing Christians to his service. And we see how he did that in the Middle Ages. And we'll talk about that today a bit, because it's important to see the history of the Roman Catholic Church and the role that the Pope and that church play in end-time events. This is a wolf in sheep's clothing. He will appear innocent. He will appear very sincere and very righteous before men. But the elect, those who are led by God's Spirit, those who are obedient to his laws, those who are close to God, will be able to recognize the source of the deceitful miracles and wonders that we see. And, you know, it's quite simple. He won't keep the Sabbath, right? He's a Sunday worshiper. He won't keep the holy days. He'll keep the pagan holidays. You look at a Catholic Mass and put it next to a true Passover service and look at the clever deception, and see how close they look. But when you look a little deeper, you go, man, these are the opposite. Matthew 24, verse 24. Let's go there for a minute. Talks about the end. It says, "For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to deceive, if possible, even the elect." Now this end time, again, professing Christian, he takes the name Christ. So he's a Christian by name and by name only. He's going to arrogate himself titles and honors equal to, and even attempting to exceed those of God himself. Look at verse 3 and 4, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 3. It says, "Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come, unless a falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition." So we have to have this man of sin revealed. The falling away has to occur. And I believe it has. We saw what happened worldwide, 155,000 people, and if you add them all of those who have continued to obey God and keep the Sabbath and the holy days, no matter how scattered they are, that number is pretty small. And it's the word is the falling away is an apostasy. It's a departure of faith. It means you had to have it before you can fall away from it. But we still don't have the man of sin revealed. That's yet to happen, an event that's shortly ahead of us. We know we're at the time of the end because there are many scriptures that point to that fact. Daniel, for instance, what he wrote was sealed. It was closed. That book was locked down to the time of the end. We understand it. Daniel talked about the time of the end, that people would be, coming and going, and that knowledge would be greatly increased. They'd be, coming and going to and fro throughout the earth, you know, until airplanes and until cars and until trains and ships were developed that we have now, that people weren't coming and going like this in all of human history. Knowledge, look at the knowledge that's been increased with computers and how fast and how exponentially knowledge has increased. And now we have AI. We go on next level, which is also a scary, dangerous proposition, because even though it may have some good uses, it seems that man always finds the worst possible use for a good thing. And this is, you know, a very dangerous proposition moving forward. But notice what it says here in verse 4, 2 Thessalonians 2:4, says, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. You know, it kind of reminds us of what Lucifer did before he became Satan. And Satan is deeply involved, and Satan wants one world government. He's a globalist. Now, Christ is going to have one world government, but Christ is in charge. That's the kind of government we need. But when you put the bad guy at the head, you got a problem. And we have a lot of people, I think, unfortunately, even in our country, in high positions, that will sell out America for a global government. What they don't realize is some of these people who sell the country down the tubes are going to not find themselves a seat at the table when it's all said and done. They will be used, and God says our lovers, our allies will betray us. They're going to turn against us. Now, you look at what Britain is doing right now. They're buying into the EU. They think that this is a really good thing. They don't know in the end they're going to be devoured by it, this beast power. But you know, they'll have to learn that the hard way. And again, why is all this happening? It's because they've rejected God, because they have forgotten God. They're not thankful. We're not thankful for what we have. And we have destroyed any vestige. You know, you can't pray at school. We got to take the Ten Commandments out of their schools and courthouses. And on it goes. Let's turn to the book of Revelation at the very beginning and get into some more scriptures here to identify this woman that rides the beast. We start this book, it says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him, which the Father gave him, to show his servants things which must shortly take place. And he sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John, who bore witness to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ and to all things that he saw. He said, blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and keep those things which are written in it, for the time is near. John and what he wrote and these prophecies that we read were written primarily for us, for those of us living at the end of an age, shortly before the return of Jesus Christ. Let's now go to Revelation 17. Revelation 17. We'll start in verse 1. It says, then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of the names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of the abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. So here is identified this woman In a vision that was given to John, he wrote this for us. A woman, in symbolic language of the Bible, pictures a church. The true church, for example, is pictured in Ephesians 5, verses 25 through 27, and it talks about the true church, and Christ is the head of the true church. But it says there in verse 25, Ephesians 5, husbands, love your wives as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. In Revelation 19, we mentioned this earlier, verses 7 and 8, and we turn to a lot of scriptures, but verses 7 and 8 says, let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his wife, notice, has made herself ready. And to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright, for the fine linen is the righteous act of the saints. Now, in striking contrast, we just read there in chapter 17 about another woman, an unclean woman, a defiled woman, or to use the language of the Bible, which is sometimes very plain, she is a whore. That's what the Bible calls her. It is evident that the church and the system that is described here is a counterfeit system, a defiled and fallen church. The Bible calls her Mystery Babylon, and that's an interesting phrase. Why does the Bible call her Mystery Babylon? Now, when John was inspired to write this book on the Isle of Patmos, Babylon as a city had already been destroyed. It had already been left in ruins. And it has remained a desolate waste ever since. And it's only inhabited by wild animals. And that was foretold by the prophets of old. Let's look at that because we don't want to confuse this. Go to Isaiah 13, verse 19. Isaiah 13, verse 19. And you could get on a train. Actually, you can get on a train and you can go to this site of ancient Babylon yet today, and nobody lives there. The only people who ever go there pretty much are tourists, and they just see it's desolate, and the Bible said this, and the Bible's right, and then they get back on the train and they drive away. Notice what it says, and Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited, nor will it be settled from generation to generation, nor will the Arabian pitch tents there, nor will shepherds make their sheepfold there. But wild beasts of the desert will lie there, and the houses will be full of owls, and ostriches will dwell there, and wild goats will caper there. The hyenas will howl in their citadels, and jackals in their pleasant places. Her time is near come, and her days will not be prolonged. That prophecy occurred. Jeremiah also talks about it. Let's look at one more. We could turn to more, but Jeremiah 51, verse 60. Let's start there. Jeremiah 51, verse 60. It says, so Jeremiah wrote in a book all the evil that would come upon Babylon. All these words that are written against Babylon. And Jeremiah said to Sariah, when you arrive in Babylon and see it and read all these words, then you shall say, O Lord, you have spoken against this place to cut it off, so that none shall remain in it, neither man nor beast, but it shall be desolate forever. Now it shall be when you have finished reading this book that you shall tie a stone to it and throw it into the Euphrates. And then you shall say, thus Babylon shall sink and shall not rise from the catastrophe that I will bring upon her, and they shall be weary. Thus are the words of Jeremiah. God fulfilled that. And though the city of Babylon was destroyed, though it has not been inhabited, the religion of Babylon has continued on. And that's why John wrote what he wrote about this woman at the time of the end. John was speaking of a church. He was speaking of a religion under the symbol of a woman named Babylon. And it's clear that he refers to the religion of Babylon. How did this religion of Babylon begin? If we travel back in time to a period shortly after the flood, we find the answer. Let's go to Genesis 11 and verse 2. Genesis 11, verse 2. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And it was in this land that the city of Babylon was built. This land became known as Babylonia, or later Mesopotamia. And here the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers had built up rich deposits of silt, and great crops could be grown there in abundance. But there were certain disadvantages that the people faced. The land was overrun with wild animals, and those animals were a constant danger and threat to the safety of the inhabitants. And anyone who could successfully protect the people from these wild beasts would receive great acclaim from the people. And at this point, a large, powerfully built man by the name of Nimrod appeared on the scene, and he became famous as a mighty hunter. Look at Genesis 10, verses 8 and 9. Genesis 10, 8 and 9. It says, Cush begot Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, therefore it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, it's seldom noticed, but a very significant couple of things occur or are said in these verses. It was Nimrod's success as a mighty hunter that caused him to become famous among the primitive people that lived at that time. The scripture says he was a mighty one on the earth, there in verse 8. He was a famous leader. He became a leader in worldly affairs, and he gained prestige among the people. Nimrod then devised a better means of protection than just going out and killing wild animals. Instead of constantly fighting with them, he organized people into cities, and then he surrounded those cities with walls of protection. He next organized those cities into a kingdom, and so the kingdom of Nimrod became established, and it is the very first kingdom mentioned in the Bible. And with power and with total control, Nimrod became a tyrant. Nimrod was a very ungodly ruler, and the scripture says he was a mighty one, and that doesn't just indicate that he became famous politically and powerful politically, but the phrase also has a hostile meaning. The expression comes from the Hebrew gibor, G-I-B-O-R, which means tyrant. The name Nimrod means let us rebel. Interesting that God chose the name and the man. Let us rebel. The Jewish encyclopedia says Nimrod was the one who made all the people rebellious against God. So this same rebellious nature of Nimrod can be seen from the expression that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. The word before, if we go back into the original language that was used here, carries a hostile meaning. Once again, Nimrod set himself up before God. The word before means against the Lord. Not only was Nimrod against the true God, he was also, as history clearly shows, a priest of devil worship and of heathenism in the worst kind. Eventually, Nimrod died. He was a priest king, and he was the priest king of Babylon and died. His death was greatly mourned by the people in Babylon, but though Nimrod had died, the Babylonian religion that he had founded and been a prominent part of continued, and it developed quite a bit further under the leadership of his wife, and her name was Semiramis. After Nimrod's death, his wife, Queen Semiramis, claimed that he was now the sun god, and later this adulterous and idolatrous woman gave birth to an illegitimate son named Tammuz, whom she claimed that was Nimrod reborn. Semiramis was an instrument in Satan's hand. She claimed her son was supernaturally conceived and that he was the promised seed. He was the Savior. Again, she tried to put Tammuz in the position of Christ. And not only was her child worshipped, as you look at what historians write, but the mother herself was worshipped as much or more. And this false religion, though often appearing as a real religion, began to fill the earth and remains yet to this day. And the origins of what we read about this woman in Revelation 17, this great harlot, it talks about Mystery Babylon, and an association with it can be traced from Nimrod to current day. What is the origin of a papal office, of a pope, for instance? The title Supreme Pontiff, or Pontiff Maximus, which the Pope bears today, is obviously not of Christian designation. We don't find those titles for anybody in the Bible. We didn't see them in the sermonette. Today we saw apostles and prophets and teachers and others, but we didn't see this term. What's the significance of the title? The word pontiff comes from the word pons, and it means bridge. And facio, F-A-C-I-O, means make. So the word Pontiff Maximus, when you look at it, means bridge builder. And the pagan priest kings claimed to be a bridge. They were the connecting link between this life and the next life. Popes continue to bear the title yet today. I want to look at just three quick examples of papal immorality, because this is important for you to know, and this is a study that you could do on your own. There are many books written, and frankly, most of the ones that are really good on the subject were written by cardinals and bishops and others that are actually in the Catholic Church that write about themselves and their own church. But the very character and the morals of many of the popes that we read about in history plainly show they are not the successors of Christ or of Peter. Peter was their first pope. Well, it's interesting that they chose that because, God used Peter in a powerful way in the New Testament church. He was the small stone. Christ is the rock. The church is built on the boulder. But Peter had an important role to play. And they say that, look, they're successors of Christ. And Peter, we find in truth they are successors of a pagan priesthood instead. They go back to Babylon. Many of the popes were so depraved and so base in their actions that even people who professed no religion at all were ashamed of them. Such sins as adultery and sodomy and simony. Simony is buying and selling of the papal office. Rape, murder, sorcery are all among sins that have been committed by not just one or two, but many of the popes. Many of the popes were murderers. They knocked one guy off so that they could be the next pope. We see this, just go to history and read about him. No doubt one of the biggest murdering popes of all was a pope named Innocent III, of all things. This pope reigned from 1198 to 1216, and he surpassed all of the previous popes in murder. During his reign, Innocent had over 1 million so-called heretics murdered. This pope is the one who promoted the Inquisition. And for over 500 years, the popes used the Inquisition to maintain their power and their control. Only God knows how many really died under these popes. It's interesting, in John 8, verse 44, Christ talks about Satan being a liar and a murderer and the father of it. And when we trace Babylon to the present and we look at what's going to happen in prophecy, we're reading here in Revelation, the tie between the past and what lies shortly ahead is amazing. Let's look at a second pope example, Pope Boniface VIII, 1294 to 1303. Was a pope who practiced sorcery. This pope called Christ a hypocrite. He professed to be an atheist. He was a murderer and a sex pervert, and yet it seems almost unbelievable, but it was this pope who wrote the famous Unum Sanctum, which officially declared the Roman Catholic Church is the only one and true church, outside of which no one can be saved. Let's look at a third example, John the 23rd. This is 1410 to 1415. He was accused by 37 witnesses, mostly bishops and priests, of fornication, adultery, incest, sodomy, simony, theft, and murder. It was proved that he had violated 300 nuns, that his own secretary said he kept a harem where not less than 200 girls had been among his victims. And during the Council of Constance, the council charged him with 54 crimes of the worst kind. And yet they're claiming titles, the Vicar of Christ, right? It's absolute blasphemy. They take the title Holy Father. And this is the kind of lifestyle that many of them lived. And I'm only using 3 examples. There are dozens of examples that you can read about. Those who have studied the history of the popes know that many of them were anything but holy men. The popes began to claim that they were infallible, at least in pronouncing doctrine, if not in morals and in integrity. But how could the popes be infallible in making doctrine and yet so immoral in practice? And yet, in 1870, papal infallibility was officially made dogma. The fact is that neither in practice nor in doctrine have the popes been infallible. History tells a story regarding their immorality, their crookedness, their contradicting doctrinal views. One pope literally had a body dug back up, drug into court, put clothes on him, and went into a court case against the dead person, claiming that he was wrong on doctrine, and that because he had no response, that clearly his views were correct and that guy's weren't. I mean, incredible stuff when you read about what happened in history here. And yet they claim, official dogma of the church, popes are infallible. They again have taken titles, high priest, most holy Lord. Anybody can see how blasphemous those claims really are. What about cardinals? Cardinals are also a part of the Roman Catholic Church. Next to the Pope, they're the group of men that are the next highest ranking. They're called cardinals. Again, when we read what we heard in the sermon at Ephesians 4 about Christ setting apostles and prophets and evangelists and pastors and teachers in the church, never do we find any indication that he ordained a group of cardinals. So what is the origin of the cardinals? When we study into this, it does not take very long to discover that the cardinals were a group of leading priests in the ancient pagan religion of Rome. Long before the Christian era, and later, when professing Christianity and paganism were united at Rome, producing the Roman Catholic Church, the pagan office of the cardinals was continued. And we see that this happened again and again with the Catholic Church. The way that they grew in wealth and in numbers is they assimilated belief systems with nations they conquered and adopted many of those practices into the church. We find the cardinals are not the successors of the apostles, but instead are successors of pagan priests all the way back to ancient Babylon. In the booklet, This is the Catholic Church, and this was published by the Knights of Columbus. They're a Catholic organization. They say, in ancient times, the cardinals were the chief clergy of Rome. The word is derived from the Latin word cardo, meaning hinge, and thus referred to those who were the pivotal members of the clergy, end of quote. So here it is, admitted by the Catholic Church itself, that the cardinals were originally leaders of the pagan clergy of ancient Rome, the priest of the hinge. Again, pivotal members of the clergy. Who were the priest of the hinge? So we do a little more study and we find unmistakable evidence that these priests of the hinge were the priests of Janus. And Janus was the pagan god of the doors and hinges. Janus is also known as the god of beginnings. That's why we have January, right? The first month of the year on the Roman calendar. So the god of doors and hinges, the god of beginnings. Janus was to believe the protector, the protector and the caretaker of the doors. Even today, right, we have a janitor. That's his job, right? The term, that's where it comes from. So the keeper of the doors, or Janus, was known as the opener and the shutter. And since the worship of this false god, the opener and the shutter, was very strong in Asia Minor, we understand why Christ said what he did about the church in Philadelphia. In Revelation chapter 3, verses 7 and 8, notice what Christ inspired to be written. He says, "These things says he who is holy, he who is true, who has the key of David, who opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens. I know your works. I have set before you an open door, and no one can shut it, for you have a little strength and have kept my word and have not denied my name." So again, the pagan god Janus is a counterfeit. Jesus is the true opener and shutter. He calls people, right? He opens doors for the church, or he closes them so they can preach the gospel in a powerful way or not. So when paganism and counterfeit Christianity were mixed at Rome, the College of the Cardinals, or the priest of the hinge, the clergy of Janus really, found a place in papal Rome, and we have cardinals in the Roman Catholic Church yet to this day. Why did they mix these? Again, mixing these two things united them, and it brought more money, and it brought more numbers into the church, whatever it took to grow. Besides that, the evidence of the pagan origin of the cardinals can be seen in the garments that they wear, and John referred to that in what we read in Revelation. The garments worn by the cardinals obviously is red in color. The bird, the cardinal, is red. The colors of their garments is red. In the Bible, the color of red usually typifies sin. And let's look at Isaiah 1:18, for instance. Isaiah 1:18. It says, "Come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be white as snow. Though they are red like crimson, they shall be as wool." Ezekiel the prophet makes a reference in Ezekiel 23, verses 14 and 15, to these men in ancient Babylon as well. Notice what he says. Let's just go over there, Ezekiel 23. Again, this is a reference to ancient Babylon. And he says in verse 14, but she increased her harlotry. She looked, and let me check this again here. I typed this, but I typed it wrong. Let me get this. All right, verse 14. She looked at men portrayed on the wall, images of the Chaldeans portrayed in vermilion. Vermilion is bright red. Girded with belts around their waist, flowing turbans on their heads, all of them looking like captains in the manner of the Babylonians of Chaldee. So here's another reference to a group of men in ancient Babylon dressed in bright red garments. And right down to the present day, this color red is associated with sin, right? Prostitution. You have the red light district, right? Red lights on at the door. This is a house of ill repute. This continues down through history. And in like manner, the Bible symbolized the religion of Babylon under the figure of a woman, a whore, again, dressed in scarlet red garments. As a point that I might just insert here as well, the Catholic priest and others, often people refer to them as, the father this or father that. There have been movies made recently where they're referring to a priest, a Catholic priest, as a father. The Bible condemns the use of master or father in the spiritual sense. Some people get hung up on this. God says, honor your father and mother. He literally uses the word father, and I've called my dad when he was alive my father, and there's nothing wrong with that. But to use the term in a spiritual sense, like, Father Peter or whoever the priest is not proper. It's incorrect. It's a title that really belongs to God. And the same thing with master. God talks about, servants and masters, and, you should, obey your master. Master can be used. The Mr. is master in the English language today. It's fine to call somebody a Mr. I've had people literally leave the church over that. It's insane. Come on, let's think about this for a minute. If father can be used, and God says honor your father and mother, Mr. can, master can, masters have servants, there's a lot of verses, but to use it in a spiritual sense is wrong. Reverend is wrong. If I'm doing a funeral, I always call the funeral home and say, hey, by the way, if you're doing a little brochure or program, I'm not father, I'm not reverend, just put down pastor or put down, minister or some other title. I'm not going to assume titles that really belong to God, and yet the Catholic leaders take all these titles to themselves. The other thing we see in a Catholic church is an unmarried priesthood. We have nuns that are supposed to be celibate. We also have a priesthood that is supposed to be celibate. Look at 1 Timothy 4. Again, this was addressed in the Bible. 1 Timothy 4. We'll start in verse 1 and read three verses here. 1 Timothy 4, verse 1. Now the Spirit expressly says that in the latter times some will depart from the truth, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons, speaking lies in hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron. And then he goes about listing some of the doctrines of demons, forbidding to marry, and commanding to abstain from foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. Some people will use this section of Scripture saying, look, you can eat whatever you want as long as you receive it with thanksgiving. But they don't read very well, because it's the meats that God created to be received, number one, and which one did he create to be received with thanksgiving? The clean ones. By those who believe and know the truth. People know better, right? We know these are clean, these are unclean. So this doesn't prove anything. But one of the doctrines we're focusing on right now is forbidding to marry. It is something that God says is a doctrine of demons. And it's evident that Satan and his demon hosts were behind pagan teachings, for the mysteries going all the way back to Babylon contain many similarities, many counterfeits, many parallels with the truth. The doctrine of forbidding to marry, and this applied to priests and in the Catholic Church nuns, was a doctrine held from ancient times in connection with the priests of Babylon and in their Babylon or Babylonian mystery religion. And these unmarried priests were members of a higher orders of the priesthood, and Queen Semiramis bound them to a life of celibacy. And it's kind of hypocritical, because Semiramis herself was very immoral and very adulterous as far as a woman goes. But this doctrine that came from Babylon with an unmarried priesthood began to spread to other nations. We see it in various religions of the world. Every scholar knows, says Hislop, the historian, that when the worship of Cybele, the Babylonian goddess, was introduced into pagan Rome, it was introduced in its primitive form with its celibate clergy. So this doctrine of devils, that priests have to remain unmarried and that the nuns have to remain unmarried, became established, first of all, in pagan Rome, and then it also became a part of papal Rome, of the Catholic Church. And the idea, I believe, at least in the Catholic Church, was that this celibacy would result in intended purity. Like, look, they're going to stay away from these sins. But just the opposite is what resulted. The priests were supposed to be holy men. They were supposed to abstain from having sex, but it actually did the exact opposite. Rome, for instance, during the days passed. It was called the Holy City in name only, to be honest. Reports estimate that at one point in Rome, there were over 6,000 prostitutes in the city, and the population was not more than 100,000. Historians tell us that all the ecclesiastics had mistresses. All the convents of the capital were houses of bad fame. A fish pond in Rome, which was situated right next to a convent, was drained by the order of Pope Gregory, and at the bottom of the fish pond were discovered 6,000 infant skulls. Another fish pond at a nunnery in Neinberg, Austria, was also exhumed, and the same results were found there. When the foundations of a nunnery in Italy was searched, they found in the various gardens and subterranean vaults there thousands of infant skulls as well. And they're just a few. I mean, we can read about more, but this is what happened with a celibate priesthood, the exact opposite. Further evidence that identifies the doctrine of celibacy as resulting in immorality is with the use of the confessional. The Catholics have a confessional. The confessional is used in many heathen religions, by the way, including Babylon. And wherever it has ever been used, its results have not been good. They've been corrupt. In the confessional, young girls and women confess their moral weaknesses and desires, and often the unmarried priest then could choose their victims. A full account of such corruption in connection with the confessional, along with actual cases, is given in a book written by an ex-priest himself entitled The Priest, Women, and the Confessional. And there are more than one book that has been written on this. Now, the Bible does talk about a type of confession, but it is not confessing to an unmarried priest. God says, confess your faults one to another in James 5:16. The Catholics believe that their very salvation is dependent on such confession. That's what they've been led to believe. And yet no one ever obtained forgiveness of sin from a priest. That's what they say, but that's not what in fact happens. We see that the ministers of God's true church in the New Testament, including the apostles, were married men. Maybe not all of them, but many of them were. And we also see that Paul wrote that a bishop must be blameless, the husband of one wife. God doesn't condemn being married as a minister in any case, form, or fashion. Let's also talk a little more about this mystery Babylon woman. The wealth of the Catholic Church, how has that been procured? All the way back to the days of Constantine. And remember, Constantine fought battles under, his troops would go into battle and they have a giant cross out in front of their army, and they conquered nations in the name of the cross. He really promoted that. He pretended to be converted himself. He claimed conversion. He claimed he had a vision of a cross. And anyway, a lot of damage has been done under the power of a cross. We see priests in the Inquisition were torturing people while they held up a cross. We see a lot of evidence of how they used it. But after Constantine supposedly was converted, the Roman Church continually increased in wealth and power at an amazing pace. There was a point when they had one of these pilgrimages to the Holy Land, and they said that over 2 million people went on that pilgrimage, and that they had so much money and precious vessels of gold and silver that the priest worked around the clock with rakes and shovels to accumulate it and to rake it into piles. We see that one of the ways that wealth was obtained in another way was with money that was willed to the church. And in those days, very few people knew how to write in the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages. And a priest was usually called upon to draft up the will. And you can be sure that the Catholic Church was going to get a chunk of the proceeds if the priest was drawing up the will. And to make certain that a priest would draw up the will, or at least would be present when the will was drawn up under their supervision, Pope Alexander III decreed in 1170 that no one could make a valid will except in the presence of a priest. So he enforced it. It was a rule. It was a law. And great sums of money were accumulated that way. Money has also been accumulated with mass. They have a phrase, high money, high mass. Low money, low mass. You get less. We'll pray less hard for you to get you out of purgatory because you paid less. We also see that one of the greatest example of financial abuse in the Catholic Church was for a priest to pray for a loved one and to pray them out of purgatory. And you can imagine that uneducated people who have been taught their whole life since childhood that priests have that kind of power would dedicate large sums of money to get their loved ones out of this burning flame or out of purgatory and into heaven. It's what they were taught. Many times the Catholics wouldn't allow people to have books. They didn't want people to become educated, certainly in the scriptures. Another moneymaker for the Catholic Church for a long time was the selling of indulgences. In other words, pardons for sins. You pay money and then we forgive sins. Martin Luther was opposed to that, right? He was one of the ones that protested, and he started the Lutheran Church, which left the Catholic Church. But by the way, the Protestant churches recognize that the mother church, the mother of harlots, is the Catholic Church. And they still tie themselves to it. I've been to funerals. My family is Lutheran, that's not in church. And in their own literature, in the back of the pews, you open it up and you read, and they pledge allegiance to the mother church yet. She is the mother, they are the daughter churches, but in the time of the end, watch them come back together and work together. Let's talk a little bit about the Inquisition. The Inquisition resulted in the torture and the killing of massive number of people in the Middle and Dark Ages. And why were they tortured? Because they refused the mark of the beast. What was the mark of the beast? What is going to be the mark of the beast in the future? It has to do with Sabbath keeping. One of the easiest ways for them to determine in these days, in the Middle and Dark Ages, that you were not part of the Catholic Church is that you went to church on Saturday and you worked on Sunday. And so you're a heretic. And that's the easy way to identify it. The Jews were brutally tortured. Any Sabbath keepers were brutally tortured. These people who refused to join in the worship of the church and the empire were declared anathema from Christ. They were declared heretics. But these people were people who obeyed God rather than men. They would not worship the church. They would not conform to its idolatry and its pagan beliefs and its customs. They would not worship the so-called Holy Roman Empire. And again, were bitterly persecuted as a result of that. One of the documents that ordered such persecutions was the Ad Extirpanda, which was issued by Pope Innocent IV. The document stated that heretics were to be crushed like venomous snakes. Priests, kings, and lay members were called upon to join in the crusade. And what they did is they got all the people involved. So now you can rat out your neighbor. You get involved and help us crush these venomous snakes. Any property, the Catholic Church said, that had been gotten illegally would become rightfully theirs with a clear title. And among other things, they were promised remission of all their sins if they killed a heretic. So if I go kill my neighbor because he's a Sabbath keeper and I get to keep his land, how do you think that went? It went exactly how you think it went. Not only were individuals or groups tortured, but entire cities who rejected the demands of the Catholic Church. In 1209, for example, the city of Braziers, which was taken by men who had been promised by the Pope that engaging in the crusade against heretics, that they would immediately enter heaven upon death. They would not even have to pass through purgatory to get there. went against the city, and historians say that 60,000 people in that city perished as a result of that decree. In Lavur, in 1211, the governor was hanged on a gibbet. His wife was thrown into a well and crushed with stones. 400 citizens of the town were burned alive. The Crusaders attended high mass in the morning and proceeded to take other towns in the area where people had rejected the Catholic dogma. In this siege, it's estimated that 100,000 Albigenses, Sabbath keepers, again, people who did not believe in a Trinity, fell in one day. 100,000. Their bodies were heaped together and burned. The clergy thanked God for this great victory for the church, and a hymn was composed and sung about the so-called victory. Then there was the massacre at Marindal that had been largely populated with the Waldenses, who were also Sabbath keepers. They were also people who denied the existence of purgatory, and they refused to kneel before a pope or a priest. In that town, 500 women were locked in a barn, and it was set on fire. When any of them leaped from the windows, they were received on the points of spears. It says children were murdered before their parents, and women were openly and pitifully violated in the streets. Now, any pope at any time could have stopped the Inquisition. And yet, and all he had to do really is affix a seal to a piece of paper. None of them did. The Inquisition went on for centuries. The church that employed these kind of cruel methods, could that possibly be the church Christ founded? Or would that church be the one that John's referring to in the book of Revelation that we read about, that is going to take a powerful stand at the time of the end? In Matthew 24, verse 9, let's go there quickly. Matthew 24, we'll wrap up here in a bit. I'm going to use the time today. There's so much to cover. I'll cover what I can in the time we have. Matthew 24, verse 9 says, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake." Here Jesus used two pronouns. He used they and you. They will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you. In the New Testament, in the language of the New Testament, the pronoun you, unless it's otherwise clearly identified, refers to one of two things: either converted Christians or to the nation of Israel or Judah. Sometimes it refers to both Christians and Judah or Israel. If you compare Mark 13, if you compare Luke 21 and the prophecies that we read about in Matthew, it's very clear that Jesus used the pronoun you in a dual sense, that it includes spirit-begotten Christians, and it also includes flesh-born Israelites. And we've written about this in our literature. So there's duality, and duality is found in nearly everything in God's plan and working out his purpose here below. In fact, one example is what happened in 70 AD. In 70 AD, the tribulation occurred in a typical forerunner sense to the nation of Judah, right? They were encircled, and we read about what happened there in 70 AD. Josephus writes about how ugly it got, and you know, it was so bad. There are things we wouldn't talk about in church. They're just too horrific that occurred in that kind of prototype to what's going to happen at the time of the end. In Matthew 24, continuing here, verse 10, let's continue down Matthew 24, verse 10. It says, "Then many will be offended and betray one another and will hate one another." You know, we've already saw this in COVID. Neighbors calling the cops on the neighbors. Look, they're not wearing a mask. I saw them outside. They're not giving social distance. They're having a party out in the backyard. There's more than 10 people. When it comes, look at the Catholic Church and what they did. Look, you guys get involved. If you go kill the heretic, you can have the land. And look, you don't even have to go through purgatory. You go right to heaven. All these kind of things that happened in the past will happen again. The difference is the population of Earth is not what it used to be. The numbers of people involved this time will far eclipse anything that's happened in human history. But it's the same movie, just different day. It says many, verse 11, many false prophets will rise and deceive many, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. Verse 21, for then there will be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, nor ever shall be. Verse 24, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to deceive, if possible, even the elect. I mean, as an elect, if you're one of the elect, right, you're here, sitting here today, and you go, look, I've got God's Spirit, I understand the truth, I'm trying to obey God, I'm doing the best I can. You have to stay close to God. Even Paul said, look, I got to be careful. I myself could become a castaway. Paul said that. If Paul said that, we got to think that way. Look, yeah, you're an elect right now, maybe. But stay close to God. Get ready for what's coming. And you've heard a lot of sermons recently about, get your house in order, get your act together. You clean up your life. Time is short. Look at the world. It's coming apart. Really, big picture. If you think in big picture, it's like, what is God really looking for? If he's going to give us 10 cities or 5 cities or whatever, he's got to know he can trust us with that. He's got to know that we love his law, that we want to keep it, not because we have to, but because we want to. We know it's a good law. It brings peace. It brings happiness. All of God's laws were for our best, with our best interests in mind, were written by God. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. Now that's a burden. I have to rest. I can't work. I don't even have to think about work for 24 hours. How can that be a burden? What a blessing. There are people sitting in this room and on the stream that would work 7 days a week if you weren't forced to take a day off. But God goes, no, I told you to rest. You can't even think about work. Take the time off. What a blessing. The holy days, what a blessing. Thou shalt not murder. That's a good one. Like, I don't want my kids murdered or my wife or my friends. Why? How can this be a burden? But God says, lawlessness will abound at the time of the end. And that's where we're headed. Even with our southern border, the laws are being broken. We have lawlessness. If you have lawlessness, you have anarchy. And what does that result in? Civil war. It ends up in a really ugly end picture. And that's why God says, what? Watch and pray. Stay close to God, that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass. You can escape that. You don't have to go through it if you're close to God and if you're getting your house in order and developing the right kind of character so that God can use you, and you prove it by your actions. God goes, well, I'm going to take you, this small group, to a place of protection for 3.5 years and give you some final training, and it's going to be exciting. I bet we don't have all the comforts that we have. We might have manna again. Maybe God's got something else in mind. Maybe he brings water from a rock. It's going to test people. It's going to test our character, but we're going to know at that point, okay, 3.5 years, Christ's come back. These verses in Matthew 24, where it talks about all of this, is speaking individually of truly begotten Christians who have become so lukewarm, so out of prayerful contact with God, they're not going to be accounted worthy to escape, as Luke 21:36 and other verses point out. We know that when we look at end time events, we have the seals and we have the trumpet plagues, and then we have the 7 last plagues. When we look at the seals, the first 4 seals are what? False religion, war, famine, disease, 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Then we have the 5th seal. So look at that, Revelation 6, verses 9 and 10. This phase of the Great Tribulation, and remember, this Great Tribulation is the time of Satan's wrath. God gets involved in the 6th seal. That's the heavenly signs. God goes, whoa, I'm gonna do some things here with the heavens that shake the earth and get attention of everybody. And he goes, now it's the time of my wrath. We enter the day of the Lord, that final year. And when we get to the final 7, right, the 7 last plagues, that's got to be rapid pace, like one day after another, because if all the green grass and all the fresh water and all this stuff's gone, nobody lives, right, very long. And then God will have to supernaturally go, okay, got to clean some of this up so people can live. I got it. But the time of God's wrath is pretty short. He gives people a chance that go through the tribulation, right, to come out of it and be protected. Now we read about the sealing of 144,000, an innumerable multitude who come through tribulation. They're sealed in their foreheads with God's Spirit. Mr. Armstrong has a great radio program on the topic. But the fifth seal is the last of Satan's kind of wrath against mankind. Of course, he's involved in the wars against Christ and all of that in the last year as well. But notice here the fifth seal, it's the martyrdom of the saints. And it says, and he opened the fifth seal, and I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? And a white robe was given to each of them, and it was said to them that they should rest a little while longer until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who would be killed as they were was completed. So here we see pictured the martyrs. We think of Stephen and Peter and the other apostles and people who died from the foundation of the New Testament church all the way through history in the Middle Ages, etc., that are crying aloud, asking God, how long till you avenge, our death? And they know that the scripture says, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And they know about his judgments that will come upon this deceiving false church and its leaders in the presence of the Lamb. Again, history tells us more than 50 million were killed, many for their biblically based faith and obedience to God instead of the church government of man. We're not saying they're all in the first resurrection. Many of those people just opposed the Catholic Church and weren't going to bow down to others. Others were truly called, begotten members of the church. And the same will be true at the time of the end. There will be people who just won't go along with it, whether they're called and part of God's true church or not, that will be martyred for taking a stand against this church and what it demands. Talk at the very end here about the mark of the beast. Remember, the beast that the Bible talks about in Revelation is the revived Roman Empire. It is a holy Roman Empire. We know that this woman rides the beast. And we see that this woman in Revelation 13:11 is pictured as a beast with two horns like a lamb, but speaks like a dragon. So the second beast, this one mentioned here in Revelation 13, and also the one we read about in Revelation 17, is the harlot woman who rides the beast. Now this woman clothed in scarlet, has already ridden the heads of these kingdoms. The first head, the imperial restoration of the empire by Justinian in 554. She has ridden the second head. It's a Holy Roman Empire, remember. The Frankish kingdom, which began in 774. Charlemagne was crowned in AD 800. The third head, the Holy Roman Empire, German head, Otto the Great, was crowned in 962. The fourth head, the Habsburg dynasty, the Austrian head, Charles V, crowned in 1520. The fifth head, Napoleon in his kingdom, which was the French head, crowned in 1805. The sixth head is the one the Bible talks about as the one that is, of Revelation 17:10, Italy, united under Garibaldi in 1870 to 1945. The seventh and the final head and 10 horns is the one yet to come, the revived Roman Empire with 10 kings under one leader. That's what's arising right now. That's what's being formed right now, the final resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire. And this ought to get our attention. Like all the rest has happened. It's a matter of history. If you couldn't write all that down, just go back to our booklet. It lists all those different divisions. Here's an important note, and this is something we've taught for a long time. It says, since the great whore never rode any of the 7 heads of the first 4 beasts, but did mount and ride the last 7 horns of Daniel's 4th beast, the Roman Empire, it follows that the last 7 horns of Daniel 7 and Revelation 13 are the 7 heads of Revelation 17, Once again, that's in our book. If you can get all that down, you can do it later. But we have one more resurrection to come. And when did the last one end? 1945. And we see what's happening in the world today. We've got to pay attention and watch for this woman to come on the scene. The mark of the beast is something that will be very popular. I think Satan kind of softened the whole world with COVID. Conform, go along, do what you're told. You know, under a situation of fear, people just give up their freedoms. If we can save you with a vaccine, or you're all going to die, and so you need us to protect you. People will conform because no, I don't want to die. If you'll protect me, I'll give you everything I got. And it's how the Catholic Church has assumed power in the past, right? They had your life in their hands. And they didn't have to go get the priest and find you, right? All they had to do is tell all the people, go kill the heretic and take his land, you can have it. And guess what? They all jumped on the bandwagon, and people became wealthy doing this. And when God says they're going to betray you, you know, these people who aren't close to God and aren't protected, they're going to go through some really hard things. Now, thankfully, I mean, when you die the next instant, you're in the kingdom if you don't recant and if you don't cave. But if you're caving now, man, it's going to be tough not to cave then. We've got to learn never to cave on anything ever. And that means right now, even little things, we don't cave. If we got sin in our life, get it out. Get close to God. You're going to need protection. The only way you can be like David and walk through the valley of the shadow of death and have no fear is being close to God. Because you know God will protect you. And nobody can kill you unless God lets them. Because he has mighty angels and they're about us. And as long as you're close to God and doing the right thing, nobody can take you out. Unless God goes, no, it's time for you to die. And then it was God's decision, and I'm okay with that. And the next waking moment, then I can be a part of the family and the kingdom of God. That's cool. Paul even said at one point, he goes, it'd be easier for me to die and then have to keep battling on here, but God's not letting me die yet. I got more work to do with you guys. You guys aren't ready, so I got to stay alive longer. And you know, we've got to get close to God. God says when this mark is enforced, people will not be able to buy or sell. They're not going to be able to earn a living. They're not going to earn a wage or a salary or be able to engage in business. Who enforces this mark? The church. It's not the civil government in this case. The church enforces the brand on people. It's the same power which caused the martyrdom of the saints. It brands on people the mark of the beast, the mark of the Roman Empire, not the mark of the true church of God. And this mark is received where? In the right hand and in the forehead. You know, there are some verses, many verses in the Bible, but that talk about this. Exodus 13, verse 9, for instance. I'll just read 2. It shall be a sign for you on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the Lord's law may be bound in your mouth, for with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. So this is regarding one of God's annual Sabbaths, and this is what he said about it. Deuteronomy 11, verse 18. Therefore you shall lay up these words of mine in your heart and in your soul, and bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. What is the mark, or what is the identifying sign of God's church? It always has been and always will be the Sabbath. Sabbaths, we should say plural, the holy days and the weekly Sabbath is what sets us apart. Now, there are Sabbath-keeping churches that aren't called, that don't understand the truth. But even those people, even though they're not called, they don't understand the truth. If they stand up and say, no, I'm not going to keep Sunday, I know that's not right, they'll be branded heretics and killed too. It's interesting. Martin Luther wrote in his book, he understood that the Sabbath was to be kept on Saturday, but he didn't do it. Number one, he'd have lost too many people, but number two, he'd been branded a heretic and killed with the rest of them, so he didn't have the courage to do the right thing. He did protest. He did come out of the Catholic Church and start the Lutheran Church, but God's going to test us. God has tested us already in some ways, but the tests aren't over. God has to know before he protects us and places safety that, look, I know you already. You can't be moved. When people tell you not to sing because you're going to die, you go, no, that's not true. If I'm sick, I shouldn't be there, but otherwise I should be there, and you command me to sing, I'm going to sing. You can't meet. Yeah, well, God said, forsake not the assembling, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. So that's God's telling me, look, at the time of the end, it's even more important. You need to get there. So I'm going to do that. You can't stop me. Man can't, and neither can the church. I have to do what God says. And if you continue to do what God says always, you'll be just fine. God will protect you. God will get you where you need to be. And when you start to compromise, you start to live by fear, you start to do things out of fear and make compromises, you're caving. You're recanting. Maybe that priest holding up the cross doesn't kill you. Well, he's, and the tortures and the way they tortured people, guys, I started reading through all that. I'm like, I can't possibly even talk about this at church. It is so horrific. Who thought of this crap? Like, you got to have Satan in your heart and in your mind to dream it up. It's so evil and so despicable what people had to go through and not recant. They stood their ground. There's another martyrdom of the saints coming. This brand, this mark of the beast is coming, and they will know who the Sabbath keepers are and who they're not. It's not enforced right now at this time, but it is coming, and we will not be able to hold a job or engage in business without this. Yet God says, if you receive the mark, wait till I come back, I'm going to punish you. Man, I'd rather have man punish me than God, that's for sure. And I'd like to be in the kingdom. I don't know about you. Today, all nations are described as being far from God, lawless. We know that nations have been deceived by people who masquerade as Christians under the name Christianity. There will be a united Europe, a union of 10 nations. It will be a union of church and state. The church will once again sit astride the beast. And those who are watching and praying, those who are living in obedience to God, will be accounted worthy to escape all these things that come to pass. God will protect his people. Let's make sure we're one of them.
For more information, go to our website at cogassembly.org. Copyright 2024. Church of God Assembly. All rights reserved.